This is the second video in a series on how to do a cybersecurity risk assessment and forms part of the first stage of the GRC lifecycle, Assess Risk. In the previous video, we met our client and began to understand their organization. Now we continue with the information gathering phase. If we consider what sort of information we need, we're looking at who or what is the target of the assessment, whether it's a company, a team or department, a particular office location, a particular facility. It could be an entire government agency, a particular IT system or platform. It could be on a supplier. We also need to look at what they do, what industry they're in, what customers they have, the data that they handle, processes and operations that they run, locations they operate in, regulations they're under, and any suppliers and vendors that they have. Now, this may look very similar to what we looked at in the previous video when we were in the kickoff meeting, and this is correct. In the kickoff meeting, we're more looking at defining the scope for the project, and it does mean we need to understand a lot of these sort of things that we've just mentioned, but we're probably not going to cover everything. And so in the information gathering phase, we need to ensure that we do get all the information that we've just listed out because we need that to be able to do our job. We also need to look at the role of technology and the internet. Our client may have their own IT infrastructure like servers or networks. They may use cloud computing instead. They may use both. We need to look at the devices and workstations that their employees use, whether any employees or contractors use remote or hybrid working. We need to understand their critical operational dependencies in terms of technology and systems. And we need to understand if they have any managed IT service providers, where they outsource some or all of their IT functionality. In terms of how we gather the information, we first have workshops and interviews that are quite similar to the kickoff meeting, except that, as I said, we're looking at more specific questions in this case to not just get an idea of the client so we can agree on what this risk assessment will focus on, but we really do need to understand the ins and outs of how their organization works and what they depend on to really get a good picture of it and be able to accurately come up with risks in later phases of the risk assessment process. Our client scenario created for us using AI probably has all the information that we need for now, which is in place of simulating interviews, which we cannot really do here. We would also normally request documents from the client at this stage to understand their policies, their design and architecture drawings, any previous assessments or audits that they have done. But in order to keep this risk assessment process a bit more manageable, we won't do that. We will instead look at detailed document review in the next document in the GRC lifecycle, the controls validation audit. For now, we will just use the interview information that we have from the AI output. If we then go to the assessment scope section of our risk assessment, as mentioned in the previous video, I've included sections like this all through the template to help guide you when you get to each section to give you an idea of what sort of information you should put in and also an idea of what the formatting might look like by providing an example below. So in this case, I'm going to delete all the directions and we're left with what is essentially the AI output that I got when I was creating the scenario. I then went through and tidied it up. I made it look a bit nicer, looked at the formatting, the spacing, made it more suitable to put into the report. We can now scroll down to the key stakeholder section below the narrative section of the assessment scope, where we look at the first area of specific information that we need to fill in. So when we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about people who are affected by the outcomes of risks. So when you think about any risks that affect this logistics company, obviously the people running the company, the people working in the company could be affected by them. But the company doesn't operate in isolation. It has customers. So if there's some issue with a company, then the customers will not be able to use the company's services. And the company also has freight carriers and logistics operators, basically suppliers who depend on our company here to function themselves as a business. And so if we have some kind of problem with our company, then our suppliers will not be able to receive work from us. So that affects them as well. So for the key stakeholder table, we can remove the directions, and the stakeholders I've listed here as examples are the exact ones from my completed risk assessment. So we can simply delete all these rows. And now we've filled in the stakeholders for cargo trail logistics. If we now look at the different user groups, it's similar to stakeholders, but in this case, we're looking at a more granular level in terms of different types of employees or management executives within cargo trail logistics, for example. And we may have a reason to break down suppliers into different types. Customers, we're looking at more detailed information here. So we can see for cargo trail logistics, we've split it down into the executive team, customer service, the IT team, operations, finance, HR, because these different groups of employees have different levels of access that they need to do their job. HR need access to HR systems. We don't need the customer service people accessing HR information. We don't need the HR team talking to customers in the way customer service would. So now we're looking to break it down into, you could say, job roles, basically. Can then remove the directions for user groups and these prompts here. I realized I had forgot to include here in the user groups the managed service provider team. Even though we do cover them elsewhere in the suppliers section, they are technically a user group, so I've just added them in as well. We can then move on to the business process diagram. This is where we basically take the user groups that we just listed out on the previous page, and we then use diagrams to show the different types of systems and tools that different groups interact with. And this is to demonstrate who has access to what. Basically, we can understand then if we have a particular issue with a particular tool or system or component, what sort of users will be affected. We split this into external and internal because here we have the core feature of the cargo trail logistics company, their digital logistics platform. We have internal groups interacting with it, but we've also got the external groups. We've got customers, freight carriers, logistics operators, and then some of the internal teams. We've then got these various tools and platforms internally for different teams to be able to do their job. We added in the managed service provider on the previous page in the user group list. I have not added them here because they deal with supporting in terms of patching employee devices. They have just IT help desk support, and we're not really representing that here because we don't really have a particular system or platform for that. So it's excluded from this diagram, but we've included them in the previous list of users, and we also include them in the third-party dependency table further on in the document. I use draw.io to create this diagram, which is free, so you can use that as well. At the end of this series, when I release the final completed SRA that I've been using as we go through the series, I will also release the native copies of this diagram and the next one, the technical diagram, so that you can use these as a basis for your own if you want, or as a reference. If we then remove the directions here, and we move on to IT dependencies. So in this case, we're now talking about tools, platforms, things like this that we depend on. We also look at the criticality of them because some of them are going to be more important than others. Like in this case, part of the example that you'll have in your document template, Cargo Trail Logistics is extremely dependent on the digital logistics platform. That's what their whole business is based on. They don't really do logistics themselves. They use this platform to receive orders from customers, and they then route the shipments through other suppliers, through freight suppliers. And of course, if this breaks down, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to do business. Basically, it's extremely core and important for their operations. So if I go and delete the directions, and then I'm going to copy and paste in all the information from the completed document. So we already talked about the digital logistics platform. This I will mention in a later video because as part of the additional information phase, because there were what I perceived as some gaps in the AI created scenario. And so I decided to add additional information just to simulate the fourth phase, which is information gathering. Sorry, additional information gathering, because you'll often find this information missing from what the client gives you. So given that we know the DLP is extremely important, it is hosted on AWS. So the AWS cloud infrastructure that we use to host this in a data center somewhere, this is also extremely important. We've then got resource planning software, which we use to determine resourcing levels. So basically the people that we need. We need to know what sort of shipments we have coming through at any given time so that we can schedule workers to have shifts in the warehouses to be able to handle the shipments coming in and out. So this is also quite important to make sure that we don't have too many people there doing nothing, or we don't have anyone there and we have all these shipments coming in. This is also quite important. And it's a similar thing for warehouse management software. This is used to track the actual freight shipments that are coming into the warehouses, being stored in the warehouses, and then being shipped out, in addition to things like materials for packing and securing cargo. So this is also quite high. We need to make sure we basically track our freight, because that's one of the key things about a freight company. Is all about inventory and understanding exactly what you've got, what needs to go where. We also noted in the scenario that there is a legacy version of some software. So that's definitely a big thing that we will look at later in terms of risks. Legacy software is basically old software where the provider no longer provides updates for it in terms of fixing bugs or security issues that people find. So when you have old software, it's just more likely that there'll be issues with it in terms of security vulnerabilities, ways for people to hack in, because no one's bothering to fix it. Normally, when software is supported, you have people receiving reports from consumers when they have bugs with it. You'll have them, the team checking their own software as well, and they'll find issues and they fix it so that over time you'd hopefully have fewer and fewer issues. Whereas once software is no longer supported and it becomes legacy, no one's really going to fix it. And so if a vulnerability becomes known in legacy software and people are still using it, it's highly likely that hasn't been fixed by anyone. People could go and try to fix it themselves, but generally it's just going to be an ongoing issue. So this is very important that we identify things like this. And this was specifically mentioned in my AI scenario, which I thought was really good as a way to demonstrate this issue. I'm going to copy paste it, for I didn't quite copy everything, so I need to add in a few extra things. So Accountify is just an accounting platform that I made up. This was another thing that was not mentioned initially. Most companies are going to need some kind of accounting software to be able to do financial functions. I also added Talentify. There are a lot of companies with these set of suffixes to their names, so I just thought I'd make some up. Another one that I just made up and added in, which is a HR product, because a lot of companies will have these sorts of platforms, some sort of tool or platform to support HR functions. Then when the scenario was first created by AI, it did mention SharePoint. And so I decided to expand that into the Microsoft 365 suite. That's pretty important because it's what people use every day to as productivity tools to do their job. And then we also have Microsoft Sentinel, which is a platform used to receive logs, where we have platforms like or tools like the DLP. They will basically produce a record of things that happen within them. When a user does something, when a customer does something, when the platform decides to do something, when changes are made, all these things are essentially recorded, like a ship log, something like that. And then the log information is sent off to Sentinel, and Sentinel then reads information and it looks for patterns that indicate something strange is going on. And so this can be used to alert when suspicious activity is detected. Then move on to information assets, where we are listing out any confidential or sensitive information covered by the assessment. This may include personally identifiable information, which would be people's names. It could be identifiers like driver's licenses, um, passports, contact details like their email, their physical address, their phone number, things like this, but then also other personal information such as race, religion, because we're talking about a company in this case, or your client may be a government department, something like that. You will have things like trade secrets as well, commercial or financial information, may even be national defense information. So it's important that we understand and list out these types of information assets because this is a big part of what we're protecting, what the company is trying to protect. And so we need to identify them and then we can look at risks related to them. So if I get rid of the directions, this time I need to add in some more rows. In terms of information for cargo trail logistics, almost any company is going to have information about their own employees, HR information. This is, of course, important because it's important to protect this because we don't want to have our salary details being spread around. We don't want everyone to know our address, nationality, things like this, marital status. So it's important that we protect this sort of information. Because we have a proprietary piece of software here, the DLP, we've got the source code. We don't want to spend all this time and effort making our own application and then we accidentally leak all that to the whole world and other people can copy us without having put in the time and effort to create something themselves. So we need to protect this. We've also got company financial information, which we store on the Accountify platform. Obviously, we need to protect this because we don't want to just advertise our company financial information to everybody. And it also includes things like salaries. We've got supplier information and our how we do our pricing and our costing, our business model, basically. We don't want to be releasing this to people. We don't want customers who use our platform to then have their information leaked. And so since we are dealing with customers, we will be storing their information and we need to protect it. We do need the driver's licenses of the freight carrier drivers. And so we don't want to be releasing that either because that's obviously personal information. When customers are doing customs declarations to get their shipments through customs, you may not necessarily want your declaration about what's in your shipment to be publicly available either. So we do need to protect that as well. That was not as important as some of the other information, such as our own employees, our source code, and company financials. And then we've also got information about our suppliers themselves as companies. And we don't necessarily want to be just broadcasting this publicly either. So we need to protect this, though it's not as important as some of this other information. If we move on to third-party dependencies, we're now talking about companies, service providers, suppliers that support the business. In this case, because we're dealing with a logistics company that handles the routing of the shipments, it doesn't necessarily ship things themselves. We definitely have a very high dependency on suppliers. So if I delete the directions and then can put in information. So as mentioned, we need our freight carriers to move shipments around. If we don't have them, then we cannot really function. CTL cannot function as a business. We have a managed service provider, as I mentioned earlier in the user group section, who mainly supports us with patching and endpoint security, basically the devices that the employees use. And they also provide service desk operations. So if any of our employees have any issues, any IT problems, they can call up these guys who will support them to get that sorted out. We also know from the scenario information that we use a shipment routing engine. So in order to give our logistics vendors better directions, they have a more efficient route. We basically put in the departure point and the destination point for each shipment into this routing engine, and it then works out the best route. This information is then provided to freight carrier employees through the DLP mobile app. So we have this company essentially as a dependency for our DLP to function as we would ideally have it function. And we've also got a telematics provider, which is just vehicle tracking, shipment tracking, which is also not as critical as, say, the suppliers, but we do want this to be functioning, this supplier, so that we can let our customers and our own employees, like the operations team, for example, so they can understand where a shipment is at any given time. For the data flow or technical diagram, we use this to show how different tools, different pieces of software, platforms, infrastructure, things like this are interacting. Whereas previously we had the business process diagram where it was more about different types of users. Here it's not about the users, it's basically just about the technology. So we already know that the core system is the DLP in the center, hosted on AWS. And then we have all these different systems that connect to it. We have logs going to Microsoft Sentinel. We've got warehousing software to organize the shipments once they arrive at warehouses. We have peripheral things like the Accountify platform for customer invoicing and payment. We've then got core things like freight carrier systems that plug in so that we can send the information to the freight carriers. We've then got the resourcing software to determine how many employees we need to in each shift to handle different shipments coming in. We have a connection to customs clearance. We've got the routing engine we talked about in terms of a supply dependency, vehicle telematics as well. We have our GitHub code repository. I also use draw.io for this, and I will also release the finished file for this in the final video for this series, along with the business process diagram and the completed SRA. Getting towards the end, we now have scope exclusions, which is where we specifically state things which are not covered in our risk assessment. This is very important because in some cases you may have a system that very much overlaps with other ones, interacts with a lot of different systems. You may have a particular department within a company or a particular government agency, something like this, where it is a smaller component within a larger entity of some kind, and it can be a bit messy if you don't explicitly say what you're not doing as well as what you are doing. So in this case, we are not doing any cargo trails logistics regional offices because we remember from the scenario information, they do have offices around the world. We're not doing the different freight carrier suppliers because they are a very important part of the business model for CTL, but we're only looking at CTL. They may at a later date want us to look at these freight carrier suppliers if the freight carriers do not have their own security program in place. And we also just include this, that anything that's not explicitly stated as in scope is assumed to be out of scope. And finally, we move on to compliance requirements, where we're looking at different standards, frameworks, regulations, laws that apply to the client company. In this particular case, because CTL is a global company based in Australia, but we already said we're explicitly not looking at their regional offices. We're only dealing with the headquarters in Australia. I put a bunch of different example legislations and frameworks and things here. Since we're only dealing with the Australian head of the company, head office, we're not going to have things like the GDPR. They don't handle credit card data, so I remove the PCI DSS. And we're left with Australian privacy legislation and different frameworks that we're choosing to follow, such as NIST, CSF. We're looking at other NIST documents. We're looking at ISO 27001. Okay, so we've now finished extracting information from our fictional client scenario. If you have any questions about where I got the information from, you've got a full copy of what we're looking at now, the narrative section of the AI scenario. That's included in the document template. So you can go back and have a look at that if you need to. You've also got copies of the diagrams in the template. So hopefully these help to guide you, to give you an idea of how to look through your AI scenario and pull out different types of information. And if you have any questions on this sort of thing, let me know in the comments. Okay, so we've talked to our client, we've gathered a ton of information from them. In the next video, we're going to look at starting the process of finding cyber risks. And that means first understanding what a cyber risk actually is and how to look for it. Let me know in the comments below. If you had a client like Cargo Trail Logistics, what sort of information would you request from them?